David Cole noticed that his phone's battery was dead just as he needed to check his email before an important meeting. Kira was taking a shower, and her iPhone was on the bedside table, plugged into the charger. He took his wife's device without thinking that it might violate someone else's boundaries. 7 years into their marriage, they had long ago stopped hiding passwords from each other, though they had been using the privilege less and less often lately. David entered a familiar combination of numbers and opened the browser, but instead of an email service, a video appeared on the screen. The preview showed their living room, filmed from a strange angle. He frowned and hit play, assuming Kira was experimenting with some new camera for work. She sometimes recorded herself during translation sessions so she could analyze facial expressions and gestures later. What he saw made his blood freeze in his veins. On the screen was their living room, but what was happening in it had nothing to do with work. Kira was standing by the couch, and across from her was a man in a FedEx courier uniform. David recognized him. He was the same guy who regularly delivered packages to their neighborhood. Tall, athletic, with a short haircut and a wide smile, he always seemed overly friendly. David continued to watch, unable to tear himself away from the screen. The sound was on, and he could hear every word. Kira was flirting with the delivery man, touching his arm, laughing at his jokes. Then she moved closer, put her palms on his chest, and kissed him. The man responded to the kiss by pulling her to him. Further events developed rapidly and left no room for ambiguous interpretations. David turned off the video and put the phone back on the nightstand. His hands were shaking and there was a metallic taste in his mouth. He sat on the edge of the bed and tried to make sense of what exactly he'd seen. This was definitely their apartment. It was definitely Kira. It was definitely the delivery guy he'd seen at their house several times in the last month. The water was still running noisily in the bathroom. Kira was singing under the shower, some modern song that was often played on the radio. Her voice seemed carefree and happy. David got up and walked over to the window overlooking the courtyard. Downstairs, children were playing, and their mothers were sitting on benches discussing something, gesticulating vigorously. The usual Saturday idyll, which now seemed fake and out of place. He tried to remember when it might have happened. Judging by the lighting in the frame, it had been in the afternoon. Kira was wearing the blue sweater she'd worn last week when he'd gone on a business trip to Dallas. Then he had returned a day later than planned because of a canceled flight. Kira greeted him as usual, kissed him on the cheek, asked about the trip, told him about her business. He hadn't noticed any signs of guilt or strange behavior. David scrolled through the last few months of their life together in his mind. Kira had indeed become more distracted, checking her phone more often, sometimes smiling as she looked at the screen. He'd put it down to work, new clients, interesting projects. Now these little things were adding up to a completely different picture. She was happy, but not because of him. Someone else was making her smile, that special smile he remembered from the beginning of their relationship. They had met at university when David was in his final year of math, and Kira was in her second year of linguistics. She was bright, outgoing, always surrounded by friends. He was quiet and methodical, preferring the company of books to human society. Their romance seemed improbable even to themselves. Kira said his calmness and reliability attracted her after a string of relationships with unpredictable and selfish guys. David was fascinated by her energy and vitality. The first years of their marriage were happy. They rented a small apartment, saved on everything, dreamed about the future. Kira supported him during his job search after university. He helped her with translations when she was just starting her career. They planned children, discussed buying a house, made plans for decades to come. The turning point came 3 years ago when David got a promotion at an oil company. The salary doubled. There was an opportunity to buy an apartment in a good neighborhood, to start saving for the future. But along with financial stability came long working days, frequent business trips, and constant stress. David came home tired and irritated, and Kira spent her days alone, working on the computer. They had less frequent heart-to-heart talks, less frequent lovemaking, less frequent laughing together. Kira tried to bring up the subject several times, suggesting that they go on vacation, see a marriage counselor, just spend more time together. David agreed in principle, but there were always more important things to do. A project that needed to be finished by the deadline, a meeting that couldn't be rescheduled, a report due tomorrow morning. Now he realized that Kira had found a way to fill the void in their relationship, and that way turned out to be a courier with a wide smile and an athletic figure. David remembered spotting this guy outside their house a few times during off hours. Once in the evening, when FedEx's workday was long over. Another time, on a weekend, when deliveries weren't usually made. He hadn't paid much attention to it then, figuring the delivery guy lived somewhere nearby or was meeting someone in the neighborhood. The water in the bathroom turned off. David heard Kira open the shower door, taking a towel. She'll be out soon, and he'll have to talk to her like nothing happened. Pretend his world hadn't crumbled in the last 5 minutes. He walked back to the bed and picked up his cell phone, which by then had gained enough charge. David tried to imagine what the hero of some movie or book would do in his place. Would he have made a jealous scene? Pack a suitcase and leave, slamming the door? Would he have hired a hitman? All of these options seemed primitive and unsatisfactory to him. He was an analyst accustomed to a systematic approach to problem solving. This situation required careful planning and cold calculation. Kira came out of the bathroom in a white robe, her hair wrapped in a towel. She smiled at him and sat down in front of the mirror to apply her cream. Her movements were smooth and familiar. David watched her and thought about how this woman who had shared his bed with him for 7 years appeared to be a complete stranger. How many other secrets was she hiding? How many other men were there before the courier? "You look pensive," Kira said, meeting his gaze in the mirror. "Trouble at work?" "No, nothing's wrong," David replied. "Just tired." She nodded and continued with her treatments. David lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling, contemplating the situation. His first impulse was to make a scene, to demand an explanation, to kick her out of the house. But he quickly realized that an emotional reaction would not bring him satisfaction. Kira would find excuses, cry, ask for forgiveness, perhaps even confess her love and swear that it would never happen again. He knew her well enough to predict this scenario. No, he needed time to think it over, time to decide exactly what he wanted to do. Divorce seemed too easy a solution. Divide the assets, find lawyers, leave each to their own devices. Kira would get half of their joint savings and move on with her life as if nothing had happened. Maybe even continue her relationship with the courier or find someone else. David wanted her to pay a price for her betrayal. A real price, not a symbolic one. He'd spent 7 years of his life on this woman, built all his plans and dreams around her. She destroyed that in an instant for a moment's pleasure with a strange man. Actions like that should have consequences. "I'm going out to the store," David said when Kira was done with her treatments. "I need to get some groceries." "Okay," she replied, keeping her eyes on the phone. "Get milk and bread." David got dressed and left the house. He didn't need groceries. He needed time to think away from Kira, from their shared space, from her scent and presence. He got in his car and drove towards the city center, with no particular direction. David drove down familiar streets and thought about how little he knew about his wife's inner life. They lived in the same house, slept in the same bed, ate at the same table, and yet they were complete strangers. When did this happen? At what point had they stopped truly seeing each other? He remembered their last serious conversation. It had been 2 months ago, when Kira had suggested a weekend trip to her parents' house in Austin. David had declined, citing an urgent project. Kira had gotten upset then and said something about them turning into roommates. He hadn't taken her words seriously, thinking it was another attempt at pressure. Now he realized it was a cry for help, but understanding didn't bring relief. Rather the opposite, it made the situation even more painful. Kira hadn't just cheated on him. She'd tried to save their relationship, and when that failed, She'd found comfort in the arms of another man, and now she lied to him every day, pretending to be a loving wife. Half an hour later, he stopped outside a small office building in the business district. The second-floor sign read, "Harrison and Associates, Private Investigations." David remembered this office. A year ago, a colleague of his had hired a detective from here to follow his ex-wife, who had hidden income during divorce proceedings. At the time, it had seemed like something out of a cheap TV show to him. Now the idea of going to a private detective seemed reasonable. He went up to the second floor and pushed open the frosted glass door. In the small reception area sat a young woman at a computer. She looked up and smiled. "Welcome to the Harrison Agency. What can I do for you?" "I need to speak to a detective," David said. "It's a personal matter. Nora Harrison is available. Please come in." The woman led him into an office where a dark-skinned woman in her 40s with short hair and an attentive gaze sat behind a wide desk. She was dressed in a strict gray suit and looked professional, but not repulsive. Nora Harrison stood up and shook his hand. "Sit down," she said, pointing to the chair across the table. "Tell me what's bothering you." David sat down and was silent for a few seconds, searching for words. Telling a stranger that his wife was cheating wasn't easy. On the other hand, it was a detective's job to listen to such stories. "I suspect my wife is cheating on me," he finally said. "Or rather, I don't suspect it. I know, but I need proof and details." Nora nodded and picked up her pen. "I see. How long has this been going on?" "I don't know. I just found out today." I stumbled across a video on her phone. "A video of a man?" "Yeah, a delivery guy who delivers packages in our neighborhood." Nora wrote something down in her notebook. "Do you want to gather materials for a divorce?" "Maybe," David answered. "But I haven't decided exactly what I want to do yet. I need the full picture. How long it's been going on, whether there are other men, whether anyone else knows." "I see. Tell me about your wife. Where she works, what her daily routine is, who she hangs out with." David told us everything he knew about Kira. Her job as a translator, which allowed her to be at home most of the time. Her friend Valerie, whom she sees often. Her habits and preferences. Nora listened attentively and asked clarifying questions. "Does she go to the gym?" "No, she does yoga at home, from YouTube videos." "Any hobbies, interests?" "She reads a lot. Likes to cook new foods. She used to paint, but she gave it up last year." "And your friend Valerie, what do you know about her?" "She works at an advertising agency. She's single. She changes boyfriends a lot. They've been friends since college." Nora continued taking notes, occasionally glancing up at David. "What's the courier's name?" she asked. "I don't know. He works at FedEx delivering packages in our neighborhood. Tall, athletic, early 30s. "We'll find him," Nora said. "What are your plans for the next few days?" "Tomorrow's a work day. Kira will be home." "Good." Cell phone rings. "I'll start surveillance tomorrow morning. My fee is $300 a day plus expenses. The advance is $1,000. David took out his wallet and counted the cash. He had enough money. "One more question," Nora said, accepting the money. "Are you prepared for the possibility that the truth may be worse than you think?" David hesitated. "Worse than one courier video? What else could it be?" "Ready," he answered. Nora gave him her card and explained how the surveillance would take place. He was to behave as usual, not change his daily routine or give his wife any reason to be suspicious. He would receive daily reports via email. "Can I ask a personal question?" Nora said, when they had finished with the formalities. David nodded. "Do you love your wife?" The question caught him off guard. He had expected anything but that. "I don't know," he answered honestly. "I used to. Now I'm not sure." "Then why do you want to investigate? If there's no love, divorce will solve everything." David thought for a few seconds. "Because she deserves to be punished for what she did," he said finally. Nora looked at him carefully, but didn't say anything. David left the office feeling that he had taken the first step toward regaining control of the situation. Revenge required planning and patience. He was prepared for both. On the way home, he stopped at the store and bought milk and bread so he wouldn't come back empty-handed. Kira was sitting on the couch with her laptop working on a translation. She looked up when he walked in and smiled. "How are you doing?" she asked. "Fine," David replied and went into the kitchen to put away the groceries. He felt like an actor playing a part in a play whose plot he didn't know. But tomorrow, the real play would begin, and he intended to direct it. Nora Harrison woke up at 7:30 in the morning, as usual. For 20 years of work as a private detective, she had developed the habit of getting up early, regardless of the plans for the day. Today, she was to begin surveillance on Kira Cole, and she wanted to get into position outside the couple's home before her husband left for work. She drank coffee, studied a map of the neighborhood, and chose a few spots for surveillance. The Cole house was located in a quiet suburb of Houston, where most residents worked in offices and left around the same time in the mornings. Nora decided to park on a neighboring street that had a good view of the house entrance and driveway. At 8:30, she was already sitting in her car with tinted windows, watching the house number 743 on Maple Street. The house was typical of the neighborhood. 2-story brick with a well-maintained lawn and flower beds near the entrance. The lights were on in the windows, which meant the owners were awake. At 8 in the morning, David Cole came out of the house. Nora recognized him from his description, a tall, thin man in a business suit with a briefcase in his hand. He got into a black sedan and drove off in the direction of the business center. Now only Kira was left in the house. Nora waited another half hour before she saw movement in the first-floor windows. A woman in a pink robe walked past the kitchen window, then appeared in the living room. It was Kira Cole, an attractive, dark-skinned woman of medium height with shoulder-length curly hair. Even in her house clothes, she looked well-groomed and elegant. At 9 in the morning, the FedEx van pulled up to the house. Nora straightened in the chair and took a camera with a long lens in her hands. The courier stepped out of the van, a tall, athletic-looking man in his 30s. He wore a standard company uniform and a baseball cap with the logo. He took a small box from the back of the truck and headed for the front door. The door opened before the courier could even ring the bell. Kira stood on the doorstep in jeans and a white blouse, smiling. Nora snapped a few pictures and turned on her voice recorder, though it was impossible to record sound from this distance. The courier handed over the box, but instead of leaving, lingered at the door. They talked about something, laughing. Then Kira stepped aside, inviting him in. The courier looked around and quickly stepped inside. The door closed. Nora checked the time on her watch, 9 hours and 7 minutes. Now all that remained was to wait and watch. After 40 minutes, the door opened again. The courier came out, correcting his uniform, and headed for the van. Kira saw him off from the threshold, waved goodbye. On her face was a satisfied smile Nora photographed this moment. The courier left and Kira returned to the house. Nora wrote down the arrival and departure times in her notebook, made notes on the behavior of both parties. So far, everything confirmed David Cole's suspicions. His wife was definitely dating the courier, and their relationship was clearly beyond the call of duty. At 11 in the morning, Kira left the house, got into her red hatchback, and drove toward the mall. Nora followed, keeping her distance. Kira parked outside a Starbucks coffee shop and went inside. Nora waited a couple minutes, then went in too and took a table in the far corner where she could see the entire cafe. Kira was sitting at a table by the window with a large latte and talking on her phone. The conversation seemed animated. She was gesticulating, laughing, sometimes lowering her voice to a whisper. Nora tried to hear fragments of phrases, but the music in the cafe and the general noise made it hard to make out the words. 20 minutes later, another woman approached Kira. Nora recognized her from David's description. It was Valerie King, Kira's friend. Tall, slender, with long straight hair and bright lipstick. She was dressed in a business suit, apparently coming from work. Valerie sat down across from Kira and ordered a coffee. The friends talked animatedly about something, occasionally leaning toward each other and lowering their voices. Nora pulled out her phone and turned on the lip-reading app that sometimes helped with her work. The technology was imperfect, but sometimes it was possible to make out individual words. The app caught a few snippets. Told you, can't recognize, was right. It wasn't enough to get the gist of the conversation, but Nora noticed that Kira looked excited and Valerie looked pleased. An hour later, the friends stood up and hugged goodbye. Valerie left first. Kira stayed behind to finish her coffee. Nora followed Valerie. Valerie got into a white convertible and drove toward the business district. Nora followed her to the office building where Creative Solutions, an advertising agency, was located. Valerie disappeared into the building and Nora returned to Kira's house. Kira was already home and, judging by the light in the windows, was working at her computer in her home office. Nora settled herself at the observation post and waited for further developments. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, her patience was rewarded. The FedEx van pulled up to the house again, but this time a different courier was behind the wheel. He left the package at the door, rang the bell, and drove off without even waiting for the door to be opened. Kira came out a few minutes later, took the package and went back inside. At 4 in the afternoon, the same courier that had come in the morning showed up. This time, he didn't have any packages. He parked away from the house and texted Kira. A minute later, she came out of the house and walked over to the van. They talked about something through the open window, then the courier drove away. Nora realized that the relationship between Kira and the courier was a regular one. They had a well-established pattern of meetings that avoided the suspicions of the neighbors. A morning visit under the guise of delivery, an evening meeting to plan their next date. At 6:30, David came home. Nora watched him park the car, enter the house. The lights were on in the windows. The couple was starting their usual evening. From the outside, everything looked idyllic. A working husband coming home to a loving wife. Nora finished her surveillance and went to the office to process the information she had gathered. She needed to get the courier's name and find out the details of his relationship with Kira. Meanwhile, David Cole sat in his office in the oil company's office and made a plan. He spent the day analyzing the schedules of FedEx couriers, studying the delivery routes in his area. The information was easily obtained through the corporate account of a company that regularly used the courier service. The courier's name was Ethan Clark. 30 years old, single, worked at FedEx for 5 years. Lives in an apartment in the Midtown neighborhood, commutes to work in his own car, ends the workday at 6 p.m., then returns the van to the base and picks up his car. David studied a map of the neighborhood where Ethan worked. It was an industrial area with many warehouses and office buildings. The traffic there was heavy during business hours, but the streets were empty after 6 in the evening. The perfect place for what he had planned. At 6:30, David left the office on the pretext of meeting a client. He got into his car and drove to Midtown. The FedEx base was located in an industrial area next to warehouse complexes. David parked in an alley that overlooked the entrance to the base and waited. At 6 p.m., the couriers began returning from their routes. David recognized Ethan from a photo in the company's database. He parked the van, threw a bag of personal belongings into his sedan, and headed for the exit. David followed, keeping his distance. Ethan drove at a leisurely pace, apparently heading home after a hard day's work. But instead of turning toward his neighborhood, he turned toward the park. David grinned. Apparently, the delivery man had decided to take a short walk before heading home. The park was in a quiet neighborhood, surrounded by residential neighborhoods. It wasn't crowded at this time of day. A few joggers, moms with kids on the playground, older people on the benches. Ethan parked at the entrance to the park and walked down the main avenue. David waited a few minutes, then got out of the car too. He had a baseball bat in his gym bag. He'd always carried it in his car ever since the city had seen an increase in robberies of motorists a few years ago. Today, the bat would come in handy for another purpose. Ethan was walking down the driveway, talking on his cell phone. Judging by his voice and laughter, the conversation was pleasant. Perhaps he was talking to Kira, planning their next meeting. David quickened his step, approaching the delivery man. The alley went deeper into the park, where the trees grew thicker and the lighting was worse. The perfect place for an attack. David looked around. There was no one nearby. Runners preferred open areas, and families with children didn't go that far from the playground. Ethan ended the conversation and tucked his phone into his pocket. At that moment, David caught up with him and called out, "Excuse me, can you help me?" Ethan turned around with a friendly smile. "Sure, what's the matter?" "I'm looking for my dog," David said, taking the bat out of his bag. "She ran away somewhere around here." Ethan didn't immediately realize what was going on. He didn't see the bat until it was flying toward his head. The first blow hit him in the temple, and he fell to the path. David threw a few more blows to make sure of the result. When it was over, David looked around. There was no one nearby. He quickly searched Ethan's pockets, took his wallet and phone, and removed his watch. A simple robbery, the kind of robbery that happened a lot in this town. The police would think the courier was the victim of a random attack. David walked back to the car, trying to walk quietly and not attract attention. He tossed the bat into a dumpster near the parking lot, his wallet and Ethan's phone into another dumpster a few blocks from the park. He kept the watch. An expensive Swiss watch might come in handy. When he got home, Kira was already cooking dinner. She lifted her head from the stove and smiled. "How was the meeting?" she asked. "Good," David replied. "The client is satisfied with our proposals." He went to the bathroom, washed his hands thoroughly, changed into his home clothes. At dinner, they talked about the plans for the weekend, about Kira's new project, about their summer vacation. The usual family conversation they'd had over the years of their marriage. David watched his wife and thought about the fact that tomorrow she would learn of her lover's death. How would she react? Would she grieve openly, or would she hide her feelings? He looked forward to that moment. After dinner, Kira worked on the computer while David watched the news. There was still no mention of Ethan Clark in the incident report. The body would be discovered tomorrow morning when joggers or utility workers came to the park. Nora Harrison, meanwhile, sat in her office and studied the information she had received during the day. She had managed to identify the courier and confirm his affair with Kira Cole. The meeting with Valerie's friend was also of interest. Perhaps she knew about the affair and even encouraged it. Tomorrow, Nora planned to talk to Kira's neighbors to see if they had noticed anything suspicious. She also wanted to follow up with Valerie and see what role she played in the story. Nora compiled a report for David Cole and emailed it to him. The report contained facts, meeting times, photos, observations of the participants' behavior. No emotional assessments or advice, just the dry information the client had ordered. Finished with her work, Nora locked up the office and drove home. Tomorrow would be another day of investigation, and she wanted to be well rested before it. Cheating spouse cases were routine in her work, but each one had its own peculiarities. The Cole story had so far followed a standard scenario, but Nora sensed there might be surprises ahead. Detective Marquis Watson arrived at the crime scene at 7 in the morning when the morning fog had not yet cleared over the park. The body of the FedEx courier was discovered by a jogger who had been running along this alley every morning for several years. The man had called the police and was now sitting on a bench, pale and shaken, answering the patrol officer's questions. Watson surveyed the scene. Ethan Clark was lying face down on the asphalt walkway, blood dried around his head in a dark stain. Judging by the nature of the wounds, the assailant had used a heavy blunt object, probably a bat or crowbar. The blows were delivered with great force, indicating the perpetrator's physical strength or extreme rage. Forensics had already begun work, photographing the scene and collecting evidence. Watson put on gloves and crouched next to the body. The victim's pockets were turned outward, and his wallet and cell phone were missing. Also missing was a wristwatch, which, judging by the mark on his wrist, Ethan wore all the time. "A simple robbery," said Patrol Officer Jones as he approached the detective. "Guy was in the wrong place at the wrong time." Watson nodded, but something about the scene bothered him. Robberies were rare in this neighborhood. The park was in an affluent neighborhood where crime was minimal. Besides, if robbery was the goal, why kill the victim? Ethan was a young, strong man, but not so strong that he wouldn't hand over his wallet without resistance. "Any witnesses?" Watson asked. Not yet. We're interviewing people who were in the park last night. Several people remember the victim. He was walking down the main avenue around 7:30. He was alone, talking on the phone. Watson wrote the information down in a notebook. Forensics will determine the time of death more precisely, but so far everything pointed to the period between 7:30 and 8 in the evening. There were plenty of people in the park at that time, but most stayed close to the main paths and the playground. "Check the security cameras at the entrance to the park," the detective ordered, "and canvass the neighborhood surrounding the park. Maybe someone saw suspicious people." 2 hours later, Watson had a preliminary picture of events. Ethan Clark, 30 years old, a FedEx courier, was killed last night between 7:30 and 7 o'clock, cause of death. Multiple blunt force trauma to the head. The robber took the victim's wallet, cell phone, and watch. A detective went to the FedEx base to talk to Ethan's co-workers. The shift supervisor, an older man with a gray beard, met him in his office. "Ethan was a good employee," he said, shaking his head. "Punctual, responsible, the customers loved him. There were no problems with him." "Enemies? Conflicts at work?" "No, nothing like that. He got along with everyone. Lately, he's been a little absent-minded, but I put that down to his personal life." "What do you mean?" "Well, he had a girlfriend. He wouldn't give details, but it was obvious he was in love. He smiled a lot, checked his phone, sometimes stayed on the route longer than usual." Watson wrote this information down. The victim's personal life could be an important lead. "Do you know who this girl is?" "No, he was secretive about that kind of thing, but I do know that she's married." "How do you know that?" "I heard him on the phone. He said something about not letting her husband find out. I didn't interfere in his private affairs, but I warned him to be careful." Watson sensed the case was taking a new turn. An affair with a married woman could give the husband a motive for murder, especially if he found out about the affair and wanted revenge. Meanwhile, Nora Harrison continued her surveillance of Kira Cole. She arrived at the house early in the morning and took the usual position. David left for work at the usual time, but the courier FedEx never showed up. Nora waited until 11 in the morning, then decided that the appointment had been canceled for some reason. Kira spent the morning at home working on her computer. At 12, she left the house and drove to the mall. Nora followed her. Kira parked outside the supermarket and went inside to shop. At the supermarket, Kira behaved as usual, choosing groceries, studying labels, standing in line at the checkout. Nothing in her behavior betrayed anxiety or anticipation. Perhaps the meeting with the courier was scheduled for another time. After the supermarket, Kira stopped by the dry cleaner, then the pharmacy, the usual household chores any housewife does. Nora was beginning to think the day was going to be boring and uninformative. At 2:30, Kira returned home. Nora settled down at the observation post and prepared to wait. But instead of a quiet day, she was in for a surprise. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Valerie King's car pulled up to the house. Kira's friend looked flustered as she got out of the car. She practically ran to the front door. The door opened before Valerie could even ring the bell. The friends talked quickly about something, then disappeared into the house. Nora turned on her camera and watched the windows. In the living room, she could see the women sitting on the couch, talking animatedly. Valerie was gesturing and Kira was shaking her head. It looked like they were discussing something very important. After half an hour, the conversation became calmer. Valerie put her arm around Kira, saying something in her ear. Kira nodded, wiping her eyes. It looked like she was crying. At 3 o'clock, Valerie left. Kira walked her to her car, and they hugged goodbye again. After her friend left, Kira didn't go back into the house right away. She stood on the porch for a few minutes, staring into the void, then slowly went inside. Nora realized that something had happened. The women's behavior was radically different from yesterday. Instead of the joyful anticipation of meeting her lover, Kira looked upset and frightened. Valerie was also out of sorts. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Nora saw Kira turn on the television in the living room. The woman sat on the couch, staring intensely at the screen. Then she stood up abruptly, walked to the window, stepped back. Her demeanor spoke of extreme agitation. Nora decided to find out exactly what Kira was watching on TV. She turned on the car radio and found the local news station. At 5 o'clock, the news bulletin began. The first news item was a murder in the park. The announcer reported that a delivery boy had been murdered last night. 30-year-old Ethan Clark was the victim of a robbery. The police are asking anyone with information about the incident to contact the station. Nora turned off the radio and looked at Kira's house. Everything was becoming clear now. Kira's lover had been murdered, and she had learned about it from the news. That's why there was no meeting this morning. That's why a distraught Valerie had arrived. Her friend must have heard the news too and rushed to support Kira. This was changing the whole nature of the investigation. Nora pulled out her cell phone and dialed the client's number. "Mr. Cole, this is Nora Harrison. I need to see you. There's been an important development." "What's happened?" David asked. "I'd rather talk to you in person. Can you come to my office at 6 o'clock tonight?" "Okay, I'll be there." Nora finished her surveillance and drove to the office. On the way, she thought about the situation. The courier's murder could have been a coincidence. Houston's crime rate left a lot to be desired, and robberies were a regular occurrence. But it could have been something more serious. What if Kira's husband found out about the affair and decided to eliminate his rival? David Cole didn't look like a man capable of murder, but adultery could drive anyone to extremes. Nora had seen it in her practice more than once. At 6 in the evening, David arrived at Nora's office. He looked calm, but the detective noticed the tension in his posture. "What was it you wanted to tell me?" he asked, sitting down in his chair. "The courier your wife was meeting with has been murdered," Nora said bluntly, "last night in the park." David was silent for a few seconds, digesting the information. "How did it happen?" "Robbery, according to the police. Hit over the head with something heavy, took her wallet and cell phone." "And you think this has something to do with, their relationship?" "I don't know. But your wife heard about the murder on the news this afternoon. She's in shock. A friend of hers came to visit, and they had a long talk." David nodded, as if that didn't surprise him. "What's next?" "Mr. Cole, I have to ask you a direct question. Where were you last night between 7:30 and 8 o'clock? David raised his eyebrows. "Do you suspect me of murder?" "I have to consider all the possibilities. A husband who learns of an affair has a motive to eliminate a rival. I was in a meeting with a client. Then I went home, had dinner with my wife. I have an alibi." "Can you give me the client's contacts?" David wrote down the phone number and gave it to Nora. "What are you going to do next?" "Continue the investigation. The police will be looking for the courier's killer. I'm going to find out how this relates to your family crisis." "Okay." Cell phone rings. "Keep me posted." After the client left, Nora called the number he'd given her. A man with a southern accent answered. "Jim Carter, Texas Energy Oil Company." "Good evening. This is private investigator Nora Harrison. I'm in charge of an investigation, and I'd like to clarify one detail. David Cole claims to have met with you last night." "Yes, that's right. We were discussing a new equipment contract. We met at the Blue Ocean at 6:30, talked till 7:30. Thanks for the information." Nora hung up the phone in thought. David's alibi was confirmed, but only partially. From 7:30 until 8 o'clock in the evening, he was free. That would be enough time to find the courier and kill him. On the other hand, how could David know where to find Ethan? And why risk committing murder when he could just divorce his wife? There were more questions than answers. Meanwhile, Kira Cole sat at home trying to recover from the shock. The news of Ethan's death had taken her by surprise. They were supposed to meet this morning, but he hadn't shown up. She'd thought he had work problems or family emergencies, and now it turned out he'd been murdered. Kira pulled out her phone and looked at their last correspondence. Ethan had texted her last night saying he missed her and couldn't wait to see her. She'd replied that she was thinking of him too, the usual lovers' correspondence that now seemed prophetic. She had met Ethan 2 months ago when he delivered a package of translations she had ordered for work. He was charming and attentive, not at all like David with his perpetual busyness and indifference. Ethan listened to her, made her laugh, complimented her. She felt herself a desirable woman, not just a wife who was taken for granted. The affair began with flirting, grew into correspondence, and then into physical intimacy. Kira realized she was playing with fire, but she couldn't stop. Ethan gave her what she lacked in her marriage: attention, passion, a sense of her own attractiveness. Now he was gone, and Kira felt not only grief, but fear. What if the murder wasn't random? What if someone knew about their relationship? What if David found out the truth and decided to take revenge? The thought made her go cold. David seemed calm and incapable of violence, but who knew how he would react to cheating? Men could be unpredictable in situations like this. Kira got up and walked around the house, checking the locks on the doors and windows. David was due back tonight, and she would have to act like nothing had happened. Pretend the courier's death didn't concern her. To hope her husband knew nothing. At 7:30, David came home. Kira met him in the kitchen where she was preparing dinner. She tried to look normal, but her hands were shaking as she chopped vegetables. "How are you doing?" David asked, kissing her on the cheek. "Fine," Kira replied. "And you?" "Busy day, lots of meetings." David sat down at the table and turned on the news on his tablet. Kira watched him furtively. Would he notice her agitation? Would he realize something was wrong with her? A news bulletin appeared on the screen. The announcer was talking about the murder of a delivery boy in the park. David listened attentively, shaking his head occasionally. "It's a terrible story," he said. "The city's getting more and more dangerous." "Yes," Kira agreed. "It's scary to think about." David looked at her carefully. "You look pale. Not feeling well?" "A little tired. I've been working hard today." "Why don't you rest after dinner?" "Yeah, I guess so." They ate dinner in relative silence. Kira forced herself to eat, though she had no appetite. David read the news and occasionally commented on the events happening in town. It was as if Ethan's death was just one of many crime reports to him. After dinner, Kira retired to the bedroom under the pretense of a headache. She lay in bed and listened to David watching television in the living room. The normal evening sounds that used to be soothing now seemed ominous. Kira closed her eyes and tried to imagine life without Ethan. A return to a boring marriage, to routine, to feeling unwanted. Ethan had been her window to another life full of emotion and passion. Now that window was slammed shut forever. Nora Harrison spent a sleepless night analyzing the information gathered. The courier's murder coincided too well with his affair with a married woman to be a mere coincidence. In the morning, she decided to conduct her own investigation in parallel with the police officer. Nora's first order of business was to go to the park where the murder had been committed. She walked down the same alley that Ethan walked on the last night of his life, trying to understand the logic of the criminal. The killer knew where the victim was going. This wasn't a random attack. Nora examined the bushes and dumpsters within a few blocks radius of the park. In a third container, a 10-minute walk from the murder scene, she found an aluminum bat with traces of blood on the handle. The perp threw the murder weapon away, but not far enough. She photographed the find and called the police. Detective Watson arrived half an hour later with a forensics team. Forensics took the bat for analysis. Partial fingerprints and traces of DNA were found on it. The next day, Nora decided to follow David. In the morning, he drove to work as usual, but instead of the office, he headed to a jewelry store downtown. Nora watched through the window as he sold something to a salesman. After David left, Nora entered the store and identified herself as a private investigator. The salesman told her that the man had sold a Swiss Omega watch, an expensive model costing about $3,000. The watch could be the same one that had been stolen from Ethan Clark. Nora immediately called Detective Watson and reported the find. He arrived at the jewelry store with a warrant to seize the watch. The clerk handed it over to the police without objection. At 5 p.m., David arrived at Nora's office for another report. He looked calm, but the detective noticed the tension in his movements. "You sold a Swiss Omega watch at the jewelry store this morning. Where did you get it?" Nora asked. "I found it at home among some old things," David answered. "The watch belonged to Ethan Clark. It was stolen during the robbery." Nora laid out on the table photos of Kira's meetings with the courier and a picture of the corpse in the park. "And here's the bat used to kill him. It's got the killer's fingerprints on it. Do you want the police to compare them with yours?" David leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. "You don't understand how I felt. 7 years of marriage and she ruined it all for casual sex with a strange man. Is that why you decided to kill him?" "I didn't plan to kill him. I just wanted to talk to him. But when I saw him, he was laughing, talking on the phone, probably to her, and I couldn't help myself." Nora recorded David's confession in a notebook. After he left, she relayed the information to Detective Watson. It was decided to arrest the suspect the next morning. David arrived home at the usual time. Kira was preparing dinner and seemed calmer than she had been in days. They ate dinner, discussing plans for the weekend. David suggested driving down to her parents' house in Austin. In the morning, at 7 o'clock, 2 police cars pulled up to the house. David heard the bell ring and realized it was time. He dressed quickly and went downstairs without waking Kira. "David Cole, you're under arrest for the murder of Ethan Clark," Detective Watson said as he pulled out his handcuffs. At that moment, Kira appeared on the stairs in her robe, awakened by voices. "What's going on?" she asked. "Your husband has been arrested for the murder of courier Ethan Clark," Watson explained. Kira turned pale and grabbed the staircase railing. David looked at his wife one last time. "I'm sorry, Kira. I knew about your relationship. I couldn't get over it." Kira realized the meaning of his words and covered her face with her hands. The police officers led David to the car. Kira stood in the doorway and watched her husband get into the back seat in handcuffs. Half an hour later, Valerie arrived. She found Kira sobbing in the kitchen. David had been arrested. He killed Ethan. "Because of me," Kira said through her tears. "What's going to happen now?" she asked. "We have to find a lawyer, sort out our finances, get through this nightmare," Valerie said. That same day, journalists learned the details of the case and besieged Kira's house. Kira had to leave the house and stay in a hotel. A week later, David was officially charged with first-degree murder. Kira filed for divorce and sold the house. She gave the money to Ethan's family, then moved back to her parents in Austin. But the past wouldn't let her go. Everyone in the small town quickly learned of the scandal. Kira became the object of judgment. A month later, she moved again, this time to another state. Nora Harrison closed the case. She had seen many family tragedies, but this story was particularly memorable. Treason had ruined 3 lives. David got a life sentence, Kira got a lifetime of guilt, and Ethan just lost his life. A year later, David Cole sat in a Texas prison cell and thought about whether the crime he committed was worth the consequences it brought. Revenge had not brought relief. Instead of justice, all he got was destruction and emptiness.